Hello there and a very good evening to you. This is Face the Nation. You're watching us live from Stein Studios in Ratmalana on TV1. Now last Thursday, Finance Minister Ravi Karunanayake presented Budget 2017 in Parliament. What really does the budget entail for the business community of Sri Lanka, for entrepreneurs and for the general public, the common man? We have an eminent panel of guests to discuss the implications of Budget 2017. Let me introduce them to you. First up, we have Mr. Sulaiman Nistar, partner, EY Sri Lanka. Good evening and thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor, Central Bank. Good evening,
Good
sir.
evening.
And finally, Shiran Fernando, lead economist at Frontier Research.
Good evening, Sonam.
Good evening, Shiran, and thanks a lot for joining us. Well, Shiran, my first question is posed to you. Sri Lankans have a tendency to think that the next year's budget should always have some handouts or concessions. But is this really the definition of a country's budget? Your time starts now.
So that, I think, typically is what is looked forward to in budgets, in particular when you look at it in terms of the political cycles when elections are put in as well. So 2015, 2016, we did see a bit of that. I would say, yes, there are a few concessions in Budget 2017, but if you look at it as a whole, I think given that you have a local government election coming up next year, and also with all the other cost of increases that you're seeing sometimes across the board, the level of concession is somewhat justified. But what's important with the budget is sending a clear signal in terms of investment, in terms of taxes, where things are going, in particular because Budget 2016, the one that you had last year, did not really meet up to expectations. There was a lot of backtracking, a lot of taxes weren't implemented. You had the whole VAT issue going on till last month. So given all that background, I think this budget could not afford to actually give a lot of concessions. Also given that we are under an IMF program as well, and there are a lot of other external issues that we need to look out for as well. So I think when you look at it in that aspect, this budget is sort of taking a step towards that. And these are the 2 years, because 2017 and 2018 are probably the 2 years that Sri Lanka can actually take on reforms before once again you start looking forward towards the 2019-20 elections. And then once again we might get into this whole fiscal issue that we've had in the past, where budgets are handouts and subsidies given. But I think this trend, if it continues, people will understand that it's about putting your fiscal house in order and giving the signals to investors about growth as well as the economy as a whole.
Shiran, the Ministry of Finance in its website says that the Executive Board of the IMF had approved a 36-month extended arrangement under the Extended Fund Facility with Sri Lanka for US dollars 1.5 billion to support the country's economic reform agenda. Now, does this mean that Sri Lanka's budget is sort of inclined towards and sort of dependent upon the IMF?
So the IMF program in itself has about 6 pillars, and some of it is focused towards what the budget actually entails in terms of revenue mobilization, improving some of the ratios when it comes to the fiscal deficit, things like that. So the budget and the IMF program also has certain targets that needs to be achieved to the budget. For example, this budget, needed to be submitted, or the IMF had to sort of look at it before it sort of went into publication. So there is a bit of nitty-gritty that happens with it. But I would say by and large, the IMF is sort of like maybe like like a watchdog in terms of looking at it, and I wouldn't say it's fully their influence in the budget.
Dr. Vijayawardena, would I be right in saying that there is a risk that the budget 2017 of Sri Lanka will be dancing to the tunes of the International Monetary Fund, given the extensive amount of funding that is being given?
I think you are wrong, Sonali, on that count, because what we have informed the International Monetary Fund is our own program. It's not a program that has been imposed on us by IMF. It is a program which had been prepared by us, signed by the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Central Bank, and the ownership of the program rests with the government of Sri Lanka, not with IMF. Therefore, when you say that we are dancing to the tune of IMF, it may be a misnomer, because the program that we had submitted to IMF has the main objective of consolidating the budget over the medium term, increasing the revenue, handling the loss-making private enterprises, public enterprises, and rationalizing the expenditure programs and so forth. And also it has, we have also promised IMF that we would be introducing a market-based exchange rate system, and also in the case of the central bank, we would be introducing the inflation targeting monetary policy in Sri Lanka. Therefore, if somebody says that we have been dancing to the tune of IMF, that's wrong. We are actually dancing to the tune of the government, because we ourselves have been the people who had promised all these measures to IMF. IMF has simply accepted them, and then we go along with the program.
Dr. Wijewardena, under the 6 pillars of Sri Lanka's IMF program, one talks about state enterprise reform. It says oversight and financial discipline of state-owned enterprises will be bolstered. Could you explain to the general public that is watching us right now, is there a danger of covert privatization?
No, it doesn't say anything about privatization, Sonali. What it says is that there have been a number of public enterprises which have been making losses in Sri Lanka, and those public enterprises have been a drain on the taxpayers like me. It is I who have to bear the losses of these public enterprises. Therefore, I have a genuine demand that the public enterprises should be reformed. They should be converted into institutions that would make profits, and therefore they will contribute to the budget, and the amount of taxes that I have to pay, Sonali, would be less than what I have been paying now. So there's nothing, no danger of, this is not called privatization, this is called reforming the public sector organizations so as to make them profitable institutions. So this is what is being given in this pillar.
Thank you very much, Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, for that response. My third question is to Mr. Suleiman Nisar, partner ENY Sri Lanka. In your opinion, how do you assess the new taxes imposed through the new budget?
In terms of tax changes, there have been a few reforms that have been introduced. So there have been fundamental changes to income tax, primarily in terms of rates. There has been a revamping of rates where lower rates have gone up to 28%, and certain exemptions have gone up to 14%, as well as direct taxes, especially in terms of a percentage to GDP. Have also increased significantly. So if you take the total tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, it has gone from 11 to 13.5 by bringing in these reforms to both income tax as well as from a new tax perspective. It is the financial services tax that has been brought in at 0.5% for all transactions done in banks. But besides that, there have been no new taxes that have been imposed in this budget, if that was your question.
In light of what you said, do you think the government is going in the right direction in terms of the measures that they've taken thus far?
I think so, in terms of the numbers that we see. 11% tax revenue to GDP being increased to 13.5, I think is very positive, and it is something that the country needs in terms of increasing revenue to pay off, especially the debt installments that are coming up. And how they've gone about increasing that percentage of revenue is primarily from, or significantly from, direct taxes, which is income tax, which is a positive for sure. You have 41% increase in direct taxes as opposed to goods and services taxes, which is about 27%, and customs taxes, which is about 18%. So I think in terms of the numbers that we see, it looks positive. Yes.
All right, thank you very much. Let me now introduce you to the journalists who will be asking the questions throughout the evening. On to my right is Nadim Majid. On to my left, Chaturanga Hapuarachi and Charita Fernando. But before opening the floor to the journalists, elsewhere in the world, we saw last week business tycoon and billionaire Donald J. Trump being voted in as the 45th President of the United States of America. It signified a change, of course, among several things. Also, it made a rise in the minds of the people, the change that they were looking for in terms of rejecting the establishmentarian order. Shiran, before opening the floor to the journalists, I'd like to ask you for your take on this in terms of change and transition. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think the Trump election, as well as what you saw with Brexit, are clear signs that you are seeing more populism rising in sort of the developed nations. Having said that, if you look at it in terms of Sri Lanka, yes, this budget, if, for example, I think I was on this program a month ago, and if you were to give me this budget or the presentation of this budget as it were now, I would be reasonably happy with it compared to what we had last year. But what is more important is things like what the developments with Trump could actually have in terms of what goes on externally, which I would feel would have a greater impact than a budget that we had. So even if you had a great budget and things externally go really bad with Trump's policies, it's very uncertain at this point what exactly his policies are. So if things externally go bad, even if you had a great budget, Sri Lanka would, there would be certain repercussions, or will sort of feel the effects of these. But with a better budget, and maybe a bit more presidential Trump rather than campaign Trump coming through, it augurs well. So that's why things like the budget sort of helps keep investor sentiment a bit high, or at least help foreign investors think that, okay, Sri Lanka is on their reform path.
Charita, let's start off with you.
Thank you, Sonali. My first question is for Dr. Wijewardena. Dr. Chandra, comparing the 2016 budget, there were criticism that it didn't reflect the Prime Minister's vision for the economy. Now, 2017 budget, does it reflect the vision of both the President and the Prime Minister? Because it looks as if the President wants to, develop or gain economic growth through agriculture, investments in health, and the Prime Minister is more inclined to open market. Do you see both these concepts reflected in 2017 budget?
Yeah. Charita, you are correct when you say that 2016 budget did not reflect the economic policy statement delivered by Prime Minister in Parliament just 2 weeks ago. And the philosophy and the goals of the economic policy statement had not been taken into account when the budget was prepared by the Minister of Finance, and it was completely at variance with the philosophy that was presented by Prime Minister in his economic policy statement. 2017 budget, of course, I see that there is some attempt made by the Minister of Finance to attain some of these goals which Prime Minister had announced in the economic policy statement. But of course we have to take into account, Charita, Prime Minister delivered his first economic policy statement in November last year. He delivered another economic policy statement in October this year, and those two economic policy statements are disjointed. There's nothing that would connect the economic policy statement. I would have loved if Prime Minister had analyzed the progress of the first economic policy statement and told us that where he had attained the goals of the first economic policy statement and where he had failed to do so, and the reasons for attainments and reasons for failures. That is the way when we have a macroeconomic strategic plan in place, because we have to look at whether we have attained it. But the economic policy statement delivered in October was completely different from, it's a completely new one. And so when you look at the overall goals, Prime Minister wanted to have the structure of income of the government change from the present 80% from indirect taxes and 20% from direct taxes to be changed into 60% from indirect taxes and 40% from indirect taxes by year 2020. Now the budget that was presented to Parliament by Minister of Finance for 2016 had actually gone in the opposite direction. Instead of reducing the indirect taxes, the budget had increased the indirect taxes to 87% and the direct taxes to reduce the direct taxes to 13%. But of course the Minister of Finance was rewarded by the delay in the implementation of the VAT program. He didn't have the VAT income at the higher rate for 6 months now. So as a result, the provisional numbers show us that the structure of the government expenditure has come down to 84% from the indirect taxes and 16% from the direct taxes. Now the budget that has been presented for 2017 has done a marginal improvement on that. It has targeted to reduce the income from the indirect taxes to 82% and increase the tax income from the direct taxes to 18%. So still we are not out of the woods. So Minister of Finance will have to do a lot during the next 3-year period to satisfy the goals that had been enshrined by the Prime Minister in his economic policy statement.
Sulaiman, as an expert on tax, I'd like to pose this question to you. Around the world, we're seeing how the digital revolution has taken over tax systems. The digitization of tax payments in the process of tax returns. We are yet to see this in Sri Lanka now. That digitization has enabled greater collection or more efficient collection of taxes. Sri Lanka is notorious for revenue leaks, especially in the tax system. Do you see anything in this budget that does anything at all to address these revenue leaks?
Yes, not specifically in this budget, but there has been a system that has been implemented in the last 2 years called the RAMIS system, where the department has converted into a new computer system, which was launched from this year. From January, I think VAT, NBT and PAY have now started. You can also file your income tax returns this November online. They facilitated that. So that, like you have said, yes, it does help to stop the leakages, because for VAT, for example, you have both sides submitting, so there is no leakage because there is a reconciliation process online, and there is less for the human intervention into changing whatever is online. So the system is a bit messy at the moment. I think they are doing everything they can to bring it into, but it has started and it's a good system is what I hear. But it will take about a year or two for the teething issues to come out and to be implemented properly.
You said that in Sri Lanka direct tax was about 11% of GDP, am I correct?
No, it's sorry, the total tax revenue was 11.6, has been increased to 13.5 this year.
And direct tax would be as a proportion of that?
Direct tax as a proportion of that would be about
In the single digits, obviously.
Yes.
1 or 2%.
About 4%.
4%.
Yeah.
For a country like Sri Lanka, given the current state that we're in economically, given the size of national debt as a percentage of GDP, what should be our target? Direct tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, what should be the target?
Well, if you take tax revenue as a whole, some of the developed countries reach about 40% of GDP. We have Malaysia at about 15, Vietnam also in the 10 to 20 range. In terms of direct tax, like I think 60-40 would be is the goal that we're trying to hit maybe in the next 4 to 5 years, and I think that would be to some extent equitable going on global scales.
Suleiman, at the beginning of the show, Sonali was also talking about handouts. We've seen a few in this budget as well. I mean, even if you are a welfare state, you still need to be a smart welfare state. Some of the proposals in this budget do not strike me as being very smart, specifically with regard to giving away tabs to advanced level students and teachers with no proper program in place. As a tax expert, you're watching this budget, and I assume that you're looking to see the country. We're being told by everyone from the Prime Minister to the Finance Minister to members of Parliament to the Governor of the Central Bank, they're all telling us that we're in dire financial straits. But somehow we can afford to hand out. So as a tax expert, when you hear policies like this or proposals like this, what goes through your mind?
Well, I'm not really sure what was the intention of giving this out. It wasn't stipulated in too much detail in the budget. But I think, yeah, it's important that priorities, it's done on some sort of prioritized basis, even if it is education, in terms of education, what priorities we need to take on first. So I think we need to relook at the intention that it was really given and what we're trying to achieve out of it. And if at all we are going to gain something from the education ministry in terms of it, is something is not very clear.
Mr. Fernando, speaking about priorities, I want to ask you a question about the education. Now, we saw through the 2016 budget that an allocation of 10 billion rupees had been made for primary upliftment, development of primary education. We are also a party to the Millennium Development Goals of the UN. That too, there too, the primary education development is mentioned. But do you think this time around, 2017 budget has given attention to the development of primary education in the country? Or education for that matter?
Education as a whole, I think there are some sort of new, I would not say innovative, but different proposals. What I think needs to, I think you have these headline things like tabs and things like that, which are more long-term strategy in terms of digitization. I think the key focus of this government is digitization. Having said that, the budget also has proposals which are counterintuitive, like increasing the levy, I think, on telecommunication from 10 to 25, which again goes against spreading. You're giving free tabs, but you're also saying, hey, I'm going to charge you more on your data levy. So that's counterintuitive. But I think as a whole, if you look at the education in this thing, there are certain innovative proposals that have been put in. It's about implementation of these. I think budget is about proposals. And what you found out with last year as well, and I think the minister has also mentioned in his speech, is that about 38 billion of the allocation has not been done as well. And that's remaining in the last 3 months as well. So even in this 800,000 tabs, is it a program for next year, or is it a program maybe in the long term? So allocation will go accordingly like that. But I think most of the proposals will have long-term benefits. I think that's a key thing to look at.
Dr. Wijayawardena, one of the things that many intellectuals, academics were looking for in this budget was clarity from the government, clarity on their economic policy, what it is that they plan to do in the next 4 years that they're going to be, or 5 years that they're going to be in power. how they're planning on getting Sri Lanka out of the debt rut that we're in. Did you, as an academic watching this budget speech, get that clarity?
No, I don't think there is clarity, Nadeem, because what has been announced in the budget by Minister of Finance is a mixture of many things, and there are howlers, there are inconsistencies in the proposals that he has made, and also he has tried to intervene in the affairs of the monetary board of the central bank by taking over some of the functions presently being undertaken by the monetary board of the central bank. So there is no clarity. I mean, if he's, if there's a clarity, he has to announce that, he doesn't care for about the central bank's independence. So what he has implied by introducing about 6 to 7 numbers of budget proposals, which actually come within the purview of the monetary board of the central bank, he has given a wrong direction to the market, signal to the market, that the government doesn't care about the independence of the central bank. But we have to recognize the fact, Nadeem, that the central bank was created as an independent institution some 66 years ago by Parliament, because it was felt that the central bank will have to conduct its monetary policy and the financial system stability policy free from the intervention of outside parties who have their own personal agendas.
But Dr. Wijewardena, we're seeing this discussion on central banks coming around the world as well, especially when you look at even in the United States, how the banking system has been misused or abused. Let's say hypothetically that I was the finance minister. I would argue that maybe accountability of the central bank is more important than the independence of the central bank.
Yes, Nadeem, in that case you have to change the leadership in the central bank. I mean, you can't just kill the independence of the central bank, because that is what I want the government to do. Because if I have a 5,000 rupee note in my purse, I want the independent central bank to protect its value. If the minister feels that the people who run the central bank are less accountable, then there is another procedure to deal with them. So instead of doing that, if he tries to take over the function of the central bank from backdoor and introduce most of the proposals which pertain to the function of the monetary board, you are actually creating a conflict of interest there, number one. Number two, you are giving a wrong signal to the people inside Sri Lanka as well as those outside Sri Lanka.
Shiran, as an economist, how do you view what Dr. Wijewardena just said about backdoor attempts or attempts to impinge on the prerogative of the central bank through the back door? How do you view those allegations?
I think what you've seen in the past as well, even with the last budget and statements after that, is infringing on territory that is probably not under his purview. In particular, I think the banking sector, for example, putting loan-to-value ratios, which is typically for things like three-wheelers, vehicles, things like that, which probably the monetary board needs to set. Looking at how credit is going, looking at inflation, and looking at the overall picture of the economy, maybe they'll be able to give particular guidance as to the exact limits, and they'll be at a better position. So questionable things, not questionable, but but I totally agree with what Mr. Wijewardena has said in that side.
Shiran, the 2016 budget, there is a list of things that has not been implemented, right? So, but there haven't been any study, review on why those things were not implemented. How important is it for a government to assess achievements and failures?
So I think the 2017 budget is a testament to the fact that 16 wasn't implemented, because you have repeats, in particular when you look at things that they talked in terms of promoting things in the stock exchange, listing of non-strategic stakes that the government actually holds, then the creation of the Development Act, things repealing the exchange control law and reforming that. So I think the repetition of it, highlights the fact that a lot of things weren't done. But also, not that it wasn't done, certain things like, for example, the New Development Act and things like that are a work in progress. But it's slow. I think that's the whole bureaucracy and the interlink within the government that's sort of taking time. But I think the fact that a lot of the things were sort of repeated, and you had a lot of repeated proposals as well, is a highlight of the fact that 2016, a lot of them weren't actually implemented.
Comparing the two, do you think the 2017 budget gives a bit of a more positive sentiment or message to investors when you compare the two?
The important thing that 2017 does it does not take two steps back. Nor does it take two steps forward. I would think it will just takes a gentle step forward and says to the business community, okay, we're not, for example, putting super gains taxes or things like that. It's not sending a negative sentiment, business sentiment in terms of that. I think because a lot of the direct taxes that Suleiman was talking about, a lot of the corporate taxes going up, a lot of the businesses were sort of expecting that to happen because that's probably the space that the government had to increase direct taxes. So in terms of that, yes, but there could have been more done in terms of infusing where growth was going, for example, because over the long term there is a lack of clear idea where growth is going to come from, because right now what you're seeing growth coming from is construction, trading activity, things like that. But over the long term, things like that matter for a lot of investors, both locally as well as foreign.
Dr. Vijayawardena, what about the expenses of the President and the Prime Minister through this budget? Has it been increased compared to the previous years?
Yeah, they have been increased. Definitely, if you go by the estimates of the government Chaturanga, they have been increased. But of course, you have to take into mind that there have been a lot of capital projects that have been proposed under the President's vote as well as the Prime Minister's vote, and therefore one has to now look at whether those capital projects are priorities. So that's the question that we have to ask ourselves. And if they are not priorities, and if the country needs more additional priorities than giving these capital projects funding to President and the Prime Minister, then of course we have done a wrong prioritization.
One question, Sonali.
Suleiman, can I ask you from your perspective, the fiscal deficit target of 4.7%, is that 4.7% of GDP, is that attainable?
I think that's more Shiran's line of questioning, but
when you consider the revenue generation proposals that have been put in place, is it attainable?
Correct. I think the revenue generation, because VAT hit in only in October, right, last from November 1st. So that entire increase in VAT, which is about I think about 30% increase in rate from 11 to 15, right? And on top of that, you have major industries coming in like telecommunications, healthcare, which was 0 earlier and now are going to be 15, as well as apartments are also now coming in to the input of it is now going to be coming into the VAT threshold. So given that, I think there is going to be a significant amount of increase in VAT from next year, which I don't know whether it most probably would have come in, but the VAT increase shown in this is only about 20%, which doesn't quite reconcile with the overall thing. So I think the revenue generating proposals are all seem to be accurate, and I think they will collect it. So from the revenue perspective, I think it looks okay.
If the implementation is there, they'll be able
yes,
to
on time, like from January and April.
Mr. Fernando, we saw at the appropriation bill level that the allocation for the digital infrastructure development has been increased. You were saying that the government looks at a more digitalized system when it comes to the long run. Do you think with the stage we are at right now, this is the correct way? This is the correct thinking. The government should focus more attention on the digital infrastructure development at the moment.
I think they should, but it's what exactly that encompasses is what matters. Is it hard infrastructure that you're putting in? For example, the telecommunication things, spectrums, are those where the infrastructure is going towards, or is it things like tablets and things like that? So the allocation, I think it really matters, but I think as a priority, because given our literacy rates and given that we're heading towards given that we're catering more towards KPO, knowledge processing type setups or BPO type setups. I think improving digital infrastructure is a step in the right way, but also other infrastructure also can't afford to be too costly as well.
I'm asking you this question in the backdrop where, though we say our literacy levels are at 98% or 95%, our IT literacy stands at about 3% or 4%, if I'm not mistaken. So with this backdrop is why, because we are in such a situation, is why I'm asking you this question.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, as a pass-through impact of it or a fallout of it, you will see literacy rates going up, and the more you provide information and data to the masses and make it affordable and for them to understand it, I think definitely you will have a lot of benefit. But in the current context where the economy is, it won't really help. But over a 3 to 4 year, 5 year period, and even more than that, I think is where you'll see the true benefit of it.
Dr. Wijewardena, now Nadeem was talking about tabs being given to high school students. Also the increment on research and innovation at universities, budget allocations. Do you think just announcing or proposing an increment is sufficient to, make use of the funds efficiently? Because I'm not sure whether we have the right environment right now for research and development. Is the environment conducive enough?
No, I think you are correct, Charita, because if we start with these research grants that are being given to universities, what I find is that the capacity of the university academics to do research, which is needed by the country at this particular point of time, has not been improved. Now, for example, I was told by one of the deans of a very leading university in Sri Lanka, he said that his university had been given some 860 million rupees to do research in the 2016 budget, but of course he doesn't know how and what kind of research they have to do, because they are not totally prepared. The reason is that you have to first decide on the type of research that will help Sri Lanka to convert our simple economy to a complex economy, and that's a matter which the government has to decide at the top, and then it has to direct the universities and other research institutions to undertake that research. Then about these the tablets that are proposed to be given to the A-level students, and Chaturanga was very correct in saying, because Sri Lanka's digital literacy is about 27% according to the survey done by the Census and Statistics Department. But of course the youth in the age category of 15 to 19, those people who represent the A-level students, the digital literacy in their case is of 57%. So what matters to us now is whether there is a demand from them for this type of tablet. So I see, in addition to the implementation problem that you are referring to, I see these type of policies are called supply driven policies, where there is no demand, but we think that if we give the tablet to these people, they will make use of the tablet in a productive way. So that is the reasoning and rationale underlying the budget proposal. But if we give something to a person who doesn't have a demand for that, number one, number two, who doesn't know how to make use of it, naturally what would happen is, you may have seen the YouTube video clip that was there in the YouTube sometime back. The daughter gifts an iPad to father as a birthday gift, and sometime later daughter asked the father how did he do with the iPad. He immediately pulls out the iPad from the kitchen cupboard and shows the daughter that it has been used as a cutting board in the kitchen. Now what I see is that if you give this kind of a tablet to a person who doesn't know how to make use of it, will simply use it as a cutting board, or he might use it to hit one of his enemies. So these are the problems that we are facing, Charita, because What we have to think of it that even though there's a necessity that we should make our people digital minded, their digital literacy should be improved. Without groundwork being done to improve the digital literacy, just giving some tablet will not help, and also the quality of the tablet also matters, Tarita, because if we give them an iPad, of course they can use it for about 5 to 6 years. But most of the cheap tablets available in the market cannot last longer than 2 years.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vijayawardena. Groundwork needs to be done before going into digitization. On that note, we go in for a short commercial break. You're watching Face the Nation. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're with Face the Nation, coming to you live on TV1. Well, we're in conversation with Mrs. Suleiman Nistar, Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena and Shiran Fernando. We're discussing the 2017 budget proposal and how it will impact Sri Lanka's economy. Accelerating growth with social inclusion. Shiran, do you think this budget is capable of doing that?
Looking at the contents of it, I don't think there is sufficient ground to say it's accelerating growth.
Why do you say that?
Because there is a lack of, right now what is required, I think, and what the budget sort of delivers is stabilization of the economy in terms of revenue, taxes, and the fiscal side of things. So once that is sort of achieved, only would it actually spur investments and things like that. On the growth side, in terms of investments, I think you did see a few things related towards foreigners and local investors, but beyond that, there wasn't a clear message, okay, this is our policy. For example, I think I think one line says that certain special investments will have its own incentive packages. Very vague, very broad, doesn't really give, what exactly, if you come to Sri Lanka, this is what you will get, this is exactly this thing. It's not outlined like that. So that's kind of thing that would sort of maybe accelerate growth.
Okay. Also in the budget, it stated that the Economic and Technology Cooperative Agreement, or ETCA, will be signed, creating new markets for exports through trade agreements, particularly with India. How does this augur for Sri Lanka, given the fact that Sri Lanka's working classes, the IT sector, for example, is up in arms against this? How is the budget proposing to go ahead with this when its major stakeholders are opposing to it?
So I think the first bit of the budget was general overview of the economy, so it brushes things like this which are being discussed. So I don't think the budget per se has anything specific towards ECTA, other than the fact that foreigners can have 5-year visas, multiple re-entries and things like that, which should probably help businessmen or investors coming in. Other than that, I think it's just merely a statement reiterating what the Prime Minister and what other ministers have been saying. So I don't think the budget itself is looking at this agreement particularly.
All right, I'd like to move my attention to Suleiman Nistar. When you take the taxation component, there is still a certain degree of ambiguity among the public when it comes to income tax. Can you specify in a nutshell and in layman's terms, will we be paying more income tax or less? How does it work?
Yeah, so it's divided into two. One is taxation on corporates and one on individuals. So if we were to go to corporates first, they haven't reduced any rates, but they have proposed a 3-tier taxation system for corporates at a low rate of 14, a standard rate of 28, and a higher rate of 40. So 28 and 40 were already there. 14 is the new rate, which is basically the rate that all those who are at 10 and 12% move up to. Right? So the lower rates of 10 and 12 have been replaced with 14. And the industries that actually get affected by this change in policy are primarily the growth industries, which we've seen, especially if you take tourism, will be going up from 12 to 28, which is a significant increase. Construction also from 12 to 28. We also have export of services, which was exempt, going up to 14. So these are, I think, the taxed areas that are doing well. So in one way you can justify it, those who are making money, let them pay a higher share. On the other side of it, the other argument would be that are you stifling these industries so that they can't grow anymore, and imposing an unnecessary burden on them where they can't reinvest or plow back because that income is taken by the government. So it can be argued both ways, but I think that they're taxing the people who can pay, and on that principle I think they've increased certain areas that are doing well in the economy. That's from the corporate tax side. From the personal tax perspective, what has happened is the maximum threshold, which was taxed at 16%, will now move up to 24%. So that is again 8% more, which is a 50% increase in those who are paying at the maximum slab, right? Professionals, again, there was a big slab at 12%. They'll also be moving to the highest bracket of 24. So the highest slab, which was 12, will move to 24. That's a 100% increase for professionals like lawyers, doctors, accountants, who were practicing a profession. So in a nutshell, those are the major changes that you would see. In addition to that, we have those who are not filing a return but who have interest income only, for example. So that was taxed at 2.5%, right? That has doubled to 5%, right? So whilst that may not be a huge increase from an individual's perspective, because you're getting 95 back, you're getting 95%. From a government's perspective, it's almost 100% increase. So which I think, in a way is a smart way of getting revenue without the masses feeling it. Similarly, dividends, which were taxed at 10, and interest on treasury bills and so forth taxed at 10, will go up by 40%. That's 14% for the 14%. So that increase is about 40%. So the government is getting 40%, but when you look at it from an individual's perspective, it's just 4% increase. Right? They've done those changes quite strategically, I think, from the masses' perspective.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Wijewardena, one question in particular that was much talked of today, the 2,500 rupee increase of the amount on road violations, with the private bus owners and the three-wheel owners associations threatening to strike. However, as at this moment, the bus strike has been called off following meetings with the minister. How do you view this, given the fact that the root cause of the problem is the fact that we keep getting vehicles into the country? Instead of addressing this problem, is it sufficient, in your opinion, to only impose fines or increase the fine already imposed?
Well, Sonali, punishments alone will not cut down the level of crimes in any society. You have to educate people, and you have to have a cultural background in society so that people will refrain themselves from committing any criminal activity. But of course, there is a theory in economics which is known as the utilitarianism, where if you increase the number of instances where you can catch a criminal, and also if you increase the cost to the criminal, he might, if he's a rational person, he might cut down his criminal activity. So that's the theory behind this. But in my opinion, these fines had been decided long time ago when the Sri Lanka rupee US dollar exchange rate was 4 rupees and 76 cents. Now today it is 150 rupees, and therefore there is a natural reason for us to increase the fines in order to reflect the current levels of expenditure patterns of the people. So in my opinion, Sonali, the 2,500 is not sufficient. It would have been increased to maybe 50,000 rupees. If you want to create an impact on the people who are to violate the traffic laws in the country, because it has become, it's not because we have a large number of vehicles on the road. It is because of the lack of discipline on the part of the motorist. So that discipline you can inculcate in them if you subject them to a higher cost.
But the massive traffic problem in Sri Lanka, the growing traffic issue, how does the budget, why is the budget failing to tackle that
No,
issue?
they have in fact attempted as a part of the government policy, and even the Minister of Finance announced it in the budget. In the urban traffic, the government is planning to have this light transit railways system in the urban areas in Colombo, so that you will be taking the vehicles that are on the road off the road. So, so there is a proposal, but of course, as you say, there's a time that would take the government to implement them, and as a result, we will not have these LTRs immediately. And finally, what would happen is then we are saddled with the same problem again and again.
Thank you very much, Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena, for your thoughts. Shiran Fernando, you have a response to the same question.
Yeah, I think if you take the statistics which show that on average every day there is 8 deaths on the road because of motor-related accidents, and you compare that against the 2,500 rupee fine, you can't equate the two. I think it's as simple as that. As Dr. Vijayawardena said, the road has a lot of ill-disciplined drivers. Does raising the fine change things? Maybe not. It won't really this thing, but it's a deterrent. It might act as a deterrent to certain people who probably might not be able to afford it. Will it bring about discipline? Depends. I mean, for example, Singapore has a lot of fines. For example, 1,000 Singapore dollars. For example, if you eat or drink when you go on their public transport systems, and if you, or even for littering, or even for throwing your chewing gum on the ground. So that has brought a sense of discipline in these countries. Whether it will bring that level of discipline here, it's a question, because the system as a whole, from the process of actually getting a license, whether the process of getting a license is actually done the right way is questionable. So when the entry towards the road is in doubt, does the 2,500 really change anything? But I think the key thing that a lot of the stakeholders need to look at is 8 deaths a day, 2,500 rupees. It's as simple as that.
All right. Chaturanga?
Yes, thanks, Sonali. A question to Dr. Vijayawardena now. We know that through the 2017 budget, a lot of loan schemes have been introduced to various avenues, be it agriculture, be it education, etc. Does this have a ripple effect, a domino effect? Do you think the government will be able to handle providing loans to this extent in the long run?
Well, of course, Chaturanga, again, it's a supply-driven policy. If there's no demand from the customers for loans, if you just give them loans, what would happen is they will abuse it. Because I have experienced this when I was in the central bank. I was the director of rural credit for about 10 years. We also had supply-driven loan schemes funded by ADB, and one good example I can quote is we had the SME loan scheme for paddy millers. We had granted about 600 loans throughout the island to enable the people to establish a paddy mill in the country. Then when we tried to examine the economic impact of them, we found that in the file in the bank manager's office, it's a complete file, and there were even photographs of the paddy mill. But when we went to the site, we found there's no paddy mill there. So what is happening when you have this supply-driven loan schemes, Chaturanga, people will abuse it. I mean, instead of the ordinary genuine borrowers borrowing these monies, what would happen is the bank manager might simply give it to his brother-in-law, son-in-law, or even brother-in-law, even wife or someone else, and they will actually cook up the books, deceiving both central bank and the central government. So these are not something that we have to do, because it should be a demand-driven thing, and if this is a demand-driven thing and if the government is facilitating for people to borrow money, then of course it will have a very quick and effective result.
Suleiman, one of the very contentious taxes that was being discussed ahead of the budget was capital gains tax. Now we've been told that it's going to come in to effect from the 1st of April 2017, but there seems to be a lot of ambiguity surrounding what capital gains tax will what are the assets that will be impacted by capital gains tax. Can you provide some clarity for us on this?
Yeah, generally capital gains was there some time back in Sri Lanka as well as part of the Inland Revenue Act, and it was imposed on all types of property, whether it be tangible or intangible, even a right, a patent, sale of that would result in a capital gain. However, this budget gives a few lines on it. It confirms the rate being 10%, and it says it will be imposed on immovable property only. Or it says it will be immovable property. I presume it will be immovable property only, meaning that things like intangible assets like shares, rights, patents, licenses wouldn't fall within a capital gain. But still the law is not out, the bill is not out. And also there was a confirmation, I think, at one of the seminars, that it wouldn't be imposed on ancestral property that you inherit and sell, or that you've held for a long period of time. So these are the indications we are getting. But the budget says it will be limited to immovable property only, meaning land, buildings, apartments, that kind of thing.
Shiran, given where Sri Lanka is right now in terms of our financial situation, if you are looking at getting out of debt eventually, specifically public debt, you must have a plan in the long term to move towards a surplus rather than deficit spending. Given where the country is right now at this juncture, do you think that capital gains tax should be extended to assets like shares as well?
When you look at it in terms of shares, I think it seems like a go-to option, but it would actually, given the lack of liquidity that you have actually in the Colombo Stock Exchange, it would actually sort of kill turnover and kill liquidity as a whole. I think certain countries, when they introduced it, if I'm not mistaken, it was Pakistan or another country, where they reintroduced it, it sort of killed liquidity for a long time, and they actually had to scrap the law, and because markets just went nowhere. It declined and then it just went nowhere. So given how small the listed market is, and given that the government is actually encouraging most firms to actually list, and looking at capital market reforms, getting funding for capital market reforms, this would probably be not the best way to look at it.
Fernando, I want to draw your attention to bring the conversation completely to layman's terms once again, and ask you a question in terms of the price reductions for goods. Now we know that green gram, dal, sprats, all the prices have been reduced for items such as this. But the belief or the idea put forward by the opposition with regard to this is that this is a reduction in the world market, a reduction in the price in the world market, and that this does not have to do anything with the budget. Is this true? Does this reduction mean that we will definitely get the prices reduced in the coming year?
It's difficult to say on each of the items where the world markets have moved specifically, because I don't track commodities at that level. But if you look at in terms of even oil, though oil prices have fallen to about $40, $50 a barrel, you only saw a change only in January 2015, towards the end of in the interim budget, even though oil prices have been low. So there wasn't a move actually to reduce it, and a key reason for that is for some of the loss-making state-owned enterprises like the CPC to actually start generating profits so that they can pay off their debt. So to answer your question, that is actually one mechanism that they have been using. So for things like water, things like electricity, things like fuel, the move is towards getting a pricing formula. So you look at world markets, you look at where Sri Lanka is, you incrementally, maybe every 6 months, you keep changing it, and that's a formula that we sort of need for these utilities, so that we don't have this argument whether can they give it in future, can they give it in this thing. There's a simple thing to basically talk about it.
Dr. Vijayawardena, it looks like we have made some progress in the tax department. Now the tax to GDP ratio is expected to rise next year. Then the minister is confident that he can increase the amount of personal tax files. Now, generating all this revenue, how disciplined do you think authorities will be in plugging the leaks?
Well, there's no discipline, Charita, because what we find is that if you take the government's fiscal thing as a big pot, into that pot the money comes from taxation and various other schemes that he has introduced, and from the pot you take out the money for expenditure. But there are a number of holes in the pot from which the revenue leaks out even without the knowledge of the Minister of Finance. Now, one example is that I have already mentioned about it, that the cost of maintaining a minister in Sri Lanka. Now, the salary plus transport allowance that we pay to a minister is some 75,000 rupees. But when we add all the other perks that we have given to a minister, like the official bungalow, he is being given 8 vehicles now, and drivers, personal staff, the maintenance of the bungalows, maintenance of the vehicles, and insurance policies for the vehicles, the total cost comes to about 6 million rupees per minister. Now these are
6 million per annum or month?
Per month. So what we have to do, Charita, is that the Minister of Finance is actually the keeper of the purse of the nation. So it is his responsibility to see that his cabinet colleagues do not use this money which he earns in the hardest way, by taxing people, by increasing the income tax, by increasing the tax rate on corporations and so forth. They have to be utilized by us in the most prudential manner, and that is where we are lacking. I mean, that is only one example I am mentioning, but there are many other examples like waste and corruption, and all the government projects are inflated above the true cost of the project, and some of the monies are being siphoned off by the people who operate the projects. Then the losses in the state on enterprises, and unless these holes are plugged effectively by the Minister of Finance, the money that is being pumped into the pot will not generate the productive employment elsewhere. So that is where we are lacking, and we don't have the discipline at all in Sri Lanka. And also, Charita, you raised the question from Shiran that about this governance in the budget. Because we have the budget, but we don't have a system of evaluating whether the budgetary targets have been attained, and if so, why we have not attained, and if we have attained, why we have attained. Because it is a requirement under the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act enacted in 2003. Along with this budget, there is a special report tabled by Finance Minister in Parliament, which is for the information of people like us, citizens of the country. And in that particular report, in terms of the law, he has to give us the projected estimates of the budget. Then he has to give us the actual realization of the budget. Then he has to explain to us in detail the deviations, why he has not been able to generate the estimates, or why he has exceeded the estimates. And then he has to give us, in terms of the law, the corrective measures. But unfortunately, the fiscal management report that had been filed with to Parliament along with the budget, and it's not actually a problem with Minister Ravi Karunanayake. Ever since we had the Fiscal Management Act passed in 2003, all the ministers of finance in this country, they use the report in order to eulogize their own activities rather than complying the requirements of the law. And nobody looks at it, even the media doesn't look at it. No parliamentarian is going to question it. It just tabled in Parliament and nobody is looking at it. So as a result, the ministers of finance in the past have been able to circumvent the legal requirement of presenting the good governance in their budgetary position, because the reports are there. None of these reports have given us what the law requires the Minister of Finance to do. So that's a serious lapse in the governance structure in the budgeting in Sri Lanka.
Sulaiman, another interesting proposal in this budget in the sphere of taxes, in the sphere of taxation, was the proposed establishment of a National Tax Council and a tax ombudsman. For the benefit of the viewing public, could you in layman's terms explain to us what the purpose of these two bodies would be?
Yeah, so the ombudsman was there a few years ago, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, where when you have a dispute with the taxing authorities and there is a legal way of settling that dispute. So when the department disagrees, they will assess you, and then you have a right to appeal, and then that process goes on for 2 years, and then you have the Tax Appeal Commission where you lodge your appeal there, and then it's heard again by a bench of judges, and then failing there you move on to the Court of Appeal. So the ombudsman, I think, I'm not sure at which level he will be present, whether it's before the assessments are raised or during the process of appeal, but it is to bring in some sort of arbitration between the parties to settle matters probably faster and more equitably if there is some injustice being done. So that is the whole purpose of it.
And in terms of the National Tax Council, it was said that this National Tax Council will comprise of persons of knowledge. What will be their purpose?
That I'm not really sure on what their purpose would be, Nadim, at this moment. We'll have to probably wait and see.
We were also talking about one of the areas of concern for Sri Lanka is exports. In fact, on this show, over the past couple of months, on more than one occasion, we've focused on the area of exports, be it in tea or labor. Or we see in the corporate income tax specifically, export of services, export of goods and deemed exports, the prevailing rate and the proposed rate, there has been an increase from 12 to 14%. Services from exempt to 14%, entrepot trade from exempt to 14%. Will this have a detrimental impact on our exports?
Exports are suffering at the moment owing to various global reasons, as well as local efficiencies not being sufficient perhaps, but the 12 to 14 I don't think is a huge impact, but certainly from 0 to 14, which is the export of services, primarily IT, BPO would come within that. Those I don't think are taking a decline at the moment. Those areas are not like commodity exports. Or
so this is basically ICT and business process outsourcing.
Yes, those are the areas that will be coming under that. And of course, entrepot trade is where there is no value addition in Sri Lanka. It's just funneled through Sri Lanka, maybe some very minimal value addition, or transported outside. So it's to facilitate trading via Sri Lanka. So that had an exemption that will go up to 14. So it will, I don't think that 12 to 14 will have that much of an impact on exports. No.
Dr. Vijayawardena, a few months ago I attended a seminar where you were, or a lecture where you were speaking basically on EDCA and the way forward. And you were speaking about the need for Sri Lanka to embrace its historic legacy as an entrepot trader. Given the tax proposals that we have seen that will impact the export sector and trade, where do you see the country moving in 2017, specifically in exports and trade?
Well, what would happen, Nadeem, is that across the board, all entrepreneurs have been taxed at a higher rate now because the government has to increase the tax to GDP ratio. And if you have this entrepreneur trading, what is necessary for Sri Lanka is to have to bring goods from other countries, stock them here, and then re-export to other destinations. And for that you must have invested in warehouses, invested in infrastructure, invested in digital computer packages and so forth, and then you will get the markets. Now I don't see any thing being proposed in the current budget. But of course, as the Prime Minister has announced in Parliament, if the Hambantota harbour is being bought by Chinese for $1 billion US dollars, the Chinese will see that it will be part of the new global Silk Road that they are going to have in Sri Lanka, because already you would have seen that they have opened the land route from China to Balochistan in Pakistan, where the goods will be brought from the western side of China to the ports in Pakistan and then re-exported to African countries and the Middle East. Now, if we don't have a strategy to be a partner of that, because we have to use the production made by China in the eastern side of China, which will come through maritime routes.
When you consider for entrepreneur trade that the tax rate will be going from exempt to 14%,
Yeah.
will this have a negative impact?
It has a negative way, definitely negative way, because no one will invest. No one will invest, because at the initial period you have to encourage these people to invest by giving them a tax break. So that is why I said that when the budget was prepared, those who have prepared the budget have not taken into account the philosophy and wisdom of the Prime Minister.
Shiran, one of the things with tax breaks is that we've seen many politicians, civil activists saying it's time to stop giving tax cuts to the wealthy. They need to start paying their fair share. Do you think that this is a case of the wealthy paying their fair share, or do you think that this will result in poor performance in the export sector?
I think as a whole, when you look at what the IMF program and the future economic trajectories, I think one advice was to relook at your tax intensive structure and maybe have a freeze on it for the moment while you rationalize things like the Income Tax Act and the Customs Act and things like that. So that's happening on one side. This on a specific sector that, for example, they've identified logistics, the Prime Minister's identified logistics as a growth sector, does not go in line with it. So that's where sort of the inconsistency lies with it. But I think as a whole you need to look at, for example, foreign investors. If you ask them, I don't think tax incentives is their major priority. A lot of them see Sri Lanka as a strategic play, looking at China, looking at India, looking at
Policy consistency would be
policy
your priority.
consistency. I would
then
say
when you
doing business, setting up a business, things like that. How quickly you can get things legislated or get things passed. Will it continue from government to government? Certain things which were promised, will it change in the next government? Those kind of things, I think. So
Well, not just change in the next government, but also change within a single government, because
yes.
From what we've been hearing in the media, from the intellectuals, from experts, from day one to now the second budget of this government, including an extraordinary budget just after coming into power, technically third budget, is that it has been a story of inconsistency rather than consistency within the same government, rather than not even from government to government. So when you consider that tale, that recent history of inconsistency, Do you think that, and given that we are now in this national government format where there are competing ideologies at work, do you think that we will have to resort to tax incentives because getting consistency is going to be a really tough job?
So I think you sort of answered the question why we have inconsistency, because of coalition politics. I think it's simple as that, and that would sort of maybe continue. But in terms of taxes, I think with the IMF, for example, on board and a greater eye towards it, I don't think they have room to go back on it, especially given that they're looking at the Income Tax Act and things like that, and Strategic Development Act in terms of investment. So it's hard to see it on that, but this government has backtracked in the past.
Dr. Wijewardena, thanks so much. Dr. Wijewardena, now we know that the government in the run-up to the 2017 budget was talking about PPPs and why we should go into PPPs. Now, do you think that through the budget this time around, the government has paved the way to focus attention for PPPs in the country?
What has happened, Chaturanga, is that the government has made a policy announcement that government would go for this PPP. But to have PPP effectively, you must have the legal mechanism in place. And we don't have a legal mechanism in Sri Lanka where we would be protecting the interest of the investors. Because when you do a contract with the government, you have to be protected from the government. And that is why in many countries there are enabling legislations that have been introduced in order to protect the interests of the people who would be going into partnership with the government. So we don't have that kind of a mechanism in Sri Lanka, number one. Number two, there is no any policy that had been announced by the government as to how PPP should be done. It is just a vague statement where the government has said they would adopt PPP. In the budget also the Minister of Finance said so. But in order to make it an effective contribution to the economy, we must have the legal background plus the policy details. So that's not available there.
One question, Mr. Fernando. Now we know that the government, or through what we spoke now, we see that the government is giving a lot of things to the public, hoping that they will adopt it and make use of it, like the loans and the technology that we spoke of. Now we are told through the budget that we are going to have a domestic airlines running in the country from the 31st of March. Do you think that this will also be something that is put on the public rather than something the public needs? What is your opinion on this domestic airline system?
So reading, I think there's not too many details on it, but from what it looks like, it is sort of like a venture between domestic tour operators. So it will be targeted probably with tourism and the Sri Lankan Air Force involved in it. So the details are a bit sketchy just from it. So I think right now, again, is it needed by the market? Because there are certain domestic tour operators that are operating. Is there a need for more is the question. So I think it'll just be a proposal which may be not taken up or implemented this year. And given that you're trying to reconstruct or restructure the already the state airline, this may not really be a high priority or something that they should actually look at.
Mr. Suleiman, could you shed light on this economic service charge on SMEs, which says that 0.5% over 12.5 million turnover? I mean, in a backdrop where we're trying to promote exports, what is the logic behind something like this?
Yeah, so economic service charge was a tax that was introduced some time back. It has been in place for several years. And there was the threshold was 50 million rupees a quarter, so any SME would be below that and wouldn't have to pay it. But in this budget they have reduced that 50 million to 12.5 per quarter, so anyone falling within that would have to pay 0.5% of turnover every quarter, but that is an advance payment of your income tax, so it's not a cost. If you have income tax, you can set it off against your income tax liability. So yes, now SMEs would have to pay it, so it is more of a cash flow issue than a taxation issue, because it's an advance payment of your income taxes.
Dr. Wijewardena, has the government focused its attention on the long run when it comes to this budget, rather than focusing its attention on the short and the medium terms?
Yeah, no long run, because I don't think they have the focus on long run, but there is a vague statement made by the Prime Minister that by year 2035 Sri Lanka will graduate to a developed country. So that's the long-term goal, but what has been done in the budget is to look at the next 3-year period, and we don't have any policy package introduced by the government to take Sri Lanka to this developed country club in about, say, 20 years time. That we don't have such a thing in Sri Lanka.
Sulaiman, would you view this as a survival budget for the government? Raise as much money as you want in order to, as much money as you can in order to meet the next debt repayment?
To an extent, I think yes, it's more of a consolidation budget if you wanted to look at it more diplomatically. But yes, it is to make sure that we have sufficient income to make sure that the expenditure and the servicing of debt can take place with some breathing space going forward.
Shiran, in that context, given if you're looking at if your main focus is consolidation or survival, diplomatically or undiplomatically, is it fair to say that it is a forward-thinking budget?
It's forward-thinking if your forward period is 12 months or 24 months, I would say. But this, I think it's a realism of the fact that in the last year's budget, the government tried to do a lot of reforms, take on a lot of reforms at one time, and they figured out it's very difficult. The coalition partners were not in agreement with it. There was a lot of negative reaction from the public, so they were trying to do a lot of big ticket reforms in one go, and that sort of failed. So I think this is sort of like an incremental thing. Doesn't have too much reforms, but is more geared towards maybe stability by improving taxes. So in the long run, you don't have to put VAT on public and things like that.
Charika, we have time for one more question.
Shiran, if you had, if you are in a position to contribute to the budget or to propose some other direction for 2017, how would you manage, or how would you propose to achieve economic growth or push growth from 5% to estimated 7%? What would you have done differently?
So first thing is I would think is 5% growth is good enough, or is it 7% growth good enough? Because whenever we've gone for 7% growth, it's been unsustainable, and then you've had adjustments. In 2011 you had that adjustment. When you look at the rupee and interest rates, in 2015, 2016 you had that adjustment when you try to go beyond 5, 6, 7%. Then you look at which sectors. So right now it's construction and non-tradable goods. So exports, clearly, I think you need to drive it. This growth, I think, should not be a 2017 target, but over the next 3 or 4 years, your average growth rate, what do you want it to be? If you want it to be 6%, one key essential thing is macro stability. And I think that's the key thing that this budget sort of highlights. There are good revenue proposals. There are good things, but then some questionable things and some ambiguous things. So as a whole, 60% maybe has really good stuff. Implement it in 2016. With the consultations, I think the minister and all are having at forums, realize where the loopholes are, where the questionable things are, and sort of maybe not implement it. And maybe try as much as possible avoid backtracking, because once one backtracking starts, the others will ensue as well. So that's really the success of it.
With that, we're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back with your final round.